Let's give this blown out raw file this awesome dark orange look using only Lightroom Classic. As always, you can follow along this tutorial by downloading the raw file from the link in the description of the video. And now let's jump into it. Right away, let's remove the leash of the dog using generative AI. Therefore, we are going to head up to the remove tool, choose the remove mode, make sure to use generative AI. And with that set up, I'm just going to roughly brush over the leash. And I'm also going to brush over this part right here. Then all we need to do is to click on remove and Lightroom will do the work for us. Now let's jump into the basic adjustments. You can see this shot is rather overexposed. To fix that, I'm going to start by changing the profile, going from Adobe Color to Adobe Neutral. If you don't see Adobe Neutral in the profile drop-down menu, you can click on the Browse button. Go into the Adobe Raw profiles right here, and there you can find Adobe Neutral. Apply it like this. The highlights are now recovered very nicely and we can start working on the basic adjustments. I want the base image to be rather dark, so I'm going to bring down the exposure quite a bit. This will also help to reveal a lot more details in the fur of this dog. I'm also going to bring down the highlights further, increasing the visible details in the fur. And then let's bring up the shadows. And let's increase the blacks to get out some more details from the darkest parts of this scene. Applying these adjustments, we are going to reduce the overall contrast of the image, but that doesn't matter because with the basic adjustments, I'm just preparing the image for the upcoming masking changes with which I'm going to apply a lot of contrast later on. So what I'm going to do as well in here is to bring up the whites just to kind of add some brilliance to the scene. And I'm always paying close attention looking at the histogram because I really don't want to blow out any of these highlights. But this is looking really good. Once we set up the exposure, we can now take a look at the white balance. I want to have this very rich, warm color tone applied on this shot. So I'm going to start this by increasing the temperature, which will give the scene a lot more warmth. Since we're using the Adobe Neutral profile, we are losing some saturation because this profile is rather flat. We can counter that problem by slightly bumping up the vibrance, but I don't want to overdo it since I'm going to be boosting specific colors later on in the editing process. So let's just bring it up a little bit like this. I also want to increase the texture, giving this shot a little more sharpness. Let's bring up the dehaze, which will help with the overall contrast of the scene. And then I kind of want to add a soft glow over everything. So I'm going to do that by bringing down the clarity very gently. Really don't want to overdo it. Something like -6 is perfect for this scene. Alright, so there we have the image after the basic adjustments. Let's compare to before real quick. You can see we have really nicely fixed the overexposure in the fur thanks to the Adobe Neutral profile. And overall, we did lose a little bit of contrast, but don't worry, we are going to change that with the next step with a bit of masking. However, let's also crop the image real quick. I want to take away a little bit from the top and a little bit from the bottom. I want to keep the dog nicely centered. That's looking cute. All right, now let's open up the masking panel and that's where the magic will happen. Let's start with something simple. I'm going to use a linear gradient and I'm going to target the out of focus foreground right here. I want to make this particular spot darker. So I'm going to bring down the exposure. Again, I'm dropping it a lot. And what this will do is it will help guide the viewer's eye towards the subject. This kind of creates a vignetting effect, which works really well for this scene. But the biggest transformation can be applied through the background. Now we need a way to target the background. Fortunately for us, this is very easy. Just create a new mask and here we are choosing Select Background. Lightroom is doing an amazing job of targeting the background. However, there are parts of the foreground selected as well. That's not what I want, so we need to modify this mask. I'm going to subtract a linear gradient and I'm just taking out the foreground. Something like this. Now I already know I want to create an artificial light source coming in from the top right corner. With that in mind, I can already modify this mask in such a way to prepare the background for this upcoming mask. That means I'm going to subtract a radial gradient. Let's make it nice and big like this. And I'm going to rotate it to fit the light source direction later on. And I want to place it somewhere in the upper right corner like this. So now we have a perfect mask for the whole soft background without the area for the light effect. What I want to do with this selection is to make it a lot darker, which will help make the dog stand out from the background. Let's again start by dropping the exposure. And then to further add contrast, I'm going to bring down the shadows. And since we want to have a very rich, warm color tone, I'm also going to alter the background by bringing up the temperature, introducing more warmth this way. I'm also going to bring up the tint, further altering the color tones of the background. We could even play around with the hue. I'm going to bring it down very, very gently, turning all green tones of the background more into a yellow, orange-ish color tone this way. And I do want to raise the saturation, so the color becomes a little more visible right there. Okay, that's looking good. I do think I want to go back to the first mask we have applied for the very near foreground, because I think the colors are still a little bit lacking right here. I do want to have a more intense green color tone, so I'm going to bring down the tint, introducing stronger greens in here. We could also play around with the saturation. I'm going to bring it up very gently, and I do think I'm going to bring down the clarity all the way, just to make the out of focus foreground a little more blurry. And I'm also going to drop the texture for that. That's starting to look really, really nice. Next, I would say let's work on that light effect. For that, let us create a radial gradient. And again, I want the light to come in from the top right corner. I'm going to make a nice and big radial gradient like this. Then let's rotate it and let's place it up in here. With this radial gradient, we are now overlapping the subject, but that's not what we want. It's really, really important to click on Subject and choose Select Subject. This way, the light effect will only alter the background of the image without changing the subject. So what we are going to do in here is to bring up the exposure, and just like that, we are creating light. Another thing we can do is to bring up the blacks, which will add a very nice soft light effect as well. And we can even bring down the dehaze, which will further improve this effect. This is looking really, really beautiful. We just need to be careful because the mask is having issues with the fine hair of the dog right here. So if you turn up these adjustments too high, this will become very visible very fast. So be very careful here. I do want this light effect to have a warm color, so again I'm using the temperature slider, and I'm just going to bring up the temperature a notch, introducing this lovely golden light. Now I'm going to add another radial gradient right away. I'm making it a little bit smaller, still I'm placing it in the same area of the image because I want to further work on that light effect. This time I'm not subtracting the subject. I want this radial gradient to overlap a tiny portion of the dog right here. Actually, let's place it a little further to the right, like this. Now again, I'm going to introduce a little more light by bringing up the exposure. Okay, increase the blacks. All right. And again, I'm going to drop the dehaze to make this effect stronger. Okay, I do want to modify this radial gradient a little more, making it a bit thicker. And I'm also going to slightly move it further to the right side. I'm still not happy with the color of this glow effect, so let me further bring up the temperature. What we can do as well is to use this little color box and introduce a specific color tone. So I want to apply something in the orange color range. Right around here looks good. And I'm going to bring up the exposure a little further. And now we have this really nice looking golden light coming in from the right side. Beautiful. Let's make it a little bigger. Okay, of course, we can also work on the subject itself. So let's create a subject mask. This mask might be a little bit too unprecise. So what I want to do is to click on those three dots, go to intersect mask with and choose select subject one more time. This will just clean up the finer hairs around the subject. It will look better this way. What I'm going to do next is to bring up the exposure very carefully. This will help further separating the dog from the background as it will become brighter. I'm also going to play around with the temperature because I want the dog to have a more pure white look. So I'm going to bring down the temperature. Of course, this will turn the hair a little bit too bluish, but don't worry. What I'm going to do next is to bring up the tint. This will kind of counter the blueness a bit. And I'm going to bring down the saturation like this. And I'm also going to bring up the texture. Okay, that's looking nice. I also want to specifically work on the eyes of the dog. For that, I'm going to use an object selection. Make sure to activate the rectangle select mode right here. And with that active, I'm just going to draw a rectangle around the eye. Let's add another object selection right away on the other eye. We can deactivate those pins in order to better see what will be happening. I'm going to click down here on never, and this will deactivate pins for now. So what I'm going to do with the eyes is to bring up the clarity first. Then I'm also going to increase the shadows. Maybe let's even raise the whites. Let's add a bit of contrast and some saturation. Okay, that's looking great. Now that we have adjusted the eyes, let me activate the pins again. I'm clicking down below here and click on always. Finally, one more mask I want to apply. Let me use a linear gradient with which I'm going to target kind of these sharp grass blades in the foreground. I only want to have this area selected, so I'm going to subtract another linear gradient, taking out the out of focus background like this. And I'm also going to subtract the subject mask. Here I want to add some kind of light effect as well, so I'm going to bring up the exposure a little bit. Let me also increase the whites. Then let's bring down the tint, making the green tones just a bit more intense this way. And I'm going to bring up the saturation. Alright, that's looking great. And there we have the image after the masking adjustments. Let me turn off all the masks so we can see the difference from before to after. Again, that's a huge change thanks to just a little bit of Lightroom masking. Now we can focus on the color grading and there's not much going on. So let's continue in the color mixer. I just want to bring up the saturation of some of these color tones. So that means orange, because I want to improve that background. For the same effect, I'm going to bring up the yellow tones and let's raise the greens. Okay, that's looking pretty. I also want to apply some split toning in the color grading panel. Here I want to work on the shadows and the midtones. I don't want to touch the highlights because that would affect the fur of the dog, which I don't want to change too much at this point. So with the shadows, I'm going to apply a warm color tone, something like this. And I'm going to only slightly bring up the saturation to really not overdo it. And I'm using the midtones again to apply a warm color tone, somewhere around here. And let's bring up the saturation. We could even bring up the midtones luminance, just making the image slightly brighter this way. Okay, and I even want to use the global color wheel. And let's add a warm hue over everything. Let's bring up the saturation just a notch. And maybe even the luminance again, making everything brighter. Beautiful. Finally, let's take a look at the calibration panel. Something I do for all of my images is to bring down the blue primary hue and bring up the saturation. Okay, that's looking great. I do think I want to head back into the color mix and just tone down the yellow tones and the green tones a bit. I actually want to reduce the green tones. I think it looks better this way, but that's the image after the color grading adjustments. The only thing left to do is the sharpening in the details panel. I'm going to bring down the radius, increase the details all the way up. Now we only want to make the subject sharper, so I'm going to use masking for that. I'm holding down the Alt key while adjusting the masking slider. Now let's bring up the amount of sharpening and we are done. I hope you will have a use for this dark orange color grading effect. Let me know what you think about it and thank you so much for watching this video.